Somewhere off the Spanish coast, a fisherman pulls something out of the water that he thinks is debris. It isn't. It's the body of a British military officer in full uniform, a briefcase chained to his wrist, documents inside marked as top secret, correspondence between Allied generals laying out the entire blueprint for the next major Allied invasion of the war. The Spanish passed those documents to the Germans. The Germans read them, believed them, and shift their forces accordingly. Entire divisions get moved, naval assets get repositioned, new defensive lines get built and on the wrong coastlines. And that dead officer in the briefcase? He had never set foot in the military. He had never held a rank. He had never even had a name like Major William Martin, because his real name was Glyndwr Michael, a homeless Welsh labourer who had died alone in an abandoned warehouse in London 3 months earlier. The British government had taken a dead stranger, given him a fake identity so detailed it included love letters, theatre ticket stubs, and a receipt for an engagement ring, and then used his corpse to personally deliver Adolf Hitler the most consequential lie of the entire European war. This is Operation Mincemeat. And before this video is over, you're going to understand exactly how it worked, why it worked, and why the man who died before any of this started is buried in Spain to this day, under a headstone that finally, 53 years later, carries his real name. Because this story starts long before a body hit the water. It starts with a memo and a very strange idea. To understand why Operation Mincemeat had to happen, you need to understand where the Allied war effort stood in early 1943. North Africa was almost done. By May of that year, the last Axis forces in Tunisia would surrender. Over 250,000 soldiers taken prisoner. It was the largest single Axis capitulation since Stalingrad. The question now was what the Allies were going to do next. The answer was clear strategically: Southern Europe. Specifically, knocking Italy out of the war by attacking it from the south, cut the Mediterranean, open supply routes, push into the soft underbelly of the Axis. Winston Churchill had been pushing this idea for over a year. The Americans weren't fully sold, but the strategic logic was hard to argue. The actual target was Sicily, the island at the southwestern tip of Italy, just 90 miles off the Tunisian coast. Capture Sicily, and you have an air bridge, a naval staging ground, and a political weapon that could topple Mussolini's government. The problem was that Sicily was also the most obvious target in the entire Mediterranean. If you're sitting in Berlin looking at a map in 1943, and you know the Allies just finished North Africa, and you know they need to invade Europe somewhere, Sicily lights up like a signal flare. It's close. It's strategically vital. It's the logical next move. Even Hitler said so. So the Allied planners, specifically Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan and his staff, faced a problem that had no clean solution. How do you surprise an enemy who already suspects what you're going to do? The answer came from a room that officially didn't exist, staffed by people who officially didn't do what they did. In 1939, before the war even began in earnest, the Director of British Naval Intelligence, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, circulated a document internally that became known as the Trout Memo. The memo was written with the style and fingerprints of Godfrey's personal assistant, a young man named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming. The Trout Memo, named because it compared deceiving an enemy to fly fishing, contained 54 ideas for using deception against Germany. Most were discarded. One, suggestion number 28, was labeled with a note that said simply, "A suggestion, not a very nice one." The idea: obtain a body, dress it in a military officer's uniform, plant false intelligence documents on it, then let the body wash ashore in a neutral country where German agents operated, making it look like a courier killed in a plane crash over the sea. It was a concept built on a specific problem in intelligence tradecraft. The hardest thing to fake is a dead man. A live double agent can be caught, turned back, or suspected. A living informant leaves traces, creates inconsistencies, has conversations that can be checked. But a dead officer discovered with documents sealed in a waterproof case, with no one alive to question, that's evidence with no cross-examination. The British intelligence establishment sat on that idea for 4 years. Then, in late 1942, 2 men pulled it off the shelf and decided to actually do it. And the reason they were able to do it, the reason it got approved at the highest levels of the British government, says as much about how desperate the strategic situation was as it does about how good the idea was. Their names were Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley. Ewan Montagu was in civilian life a barrister, sharp, methodical, skilled at constructing an argument from evidence. In the war, he held the rank of lieutenant commander and worked in naval intelligence, specifically within a body called the 20 Committee, the XX Committee, the group that managed Britain's double-cross system, the program of captured German spies who had been turned and were now feeding deliberate disinformation back to Berlin. Charles Cholmondeley was different. He was a flight lieutenant in the RAF, seconded to MI5, and described by colleagues as eccentric in ways that were genuinely useful, a lateral thinker who was comfortable with ideas that more conventional minds would have dismissed on the spot. Together, they took Suggestion 28 from the Trout Memo and turned it into something real. The plan they built had 3 interlocking requirements, and each one had to work perfectly for the others to matter. The body. It had to be a male of military age, whose cause of death would not show up on an external examination as something incompatible with drowning, specifically inconsistent with dying at sea after a plane crash over open water. And it had to be a person with no family likely to come forward. No one who would question why a military funeral had been held for someone they didn't recognize. The identity. Not just a name and rank. A life. An emotional life. Details so specific and so human that any intelligence officer reviewing the documentation would feel, instinctively, that this was a real person. Because real people don't carry around carefully curated dossiers. They carry receipts and love letters and overdue bank notices. Authenticity is noise, and the noise had to be right, the delivery point. Specifically Huelva, a port town on Spain's southwestern Atlantic coast that Montagu and Cholmondeley had identified as the single best location for their purposes. Huelva had an active German Abwehr agent named Adolf Klaus, known to be aggressive, well-connected with local Spanish authorities, and reliably capable of extracting and transmitting intelligence up the chain to Berlin. If a body washed ashore near Huelva, Klaus would know. And if Klaus knew, Hitler would know. The plan was approved at the highest levels of the British government. It was signed off by the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke. The operation received a name, Mincemeat. Now they needed a body. His name was Glyndwr Michael. He was born on January 4, 1909, in Aberbargod, a mining village in South Wales. His father died when he was young, reportedly by suicide. His mother died in 1940. After his mother's death, Michael drifted to London. He had no steady work, no fixed address, no known social network. He was, by any documentation that existed of him, a man who had been slowly erased from the visible world, not by force, but by accumulation of grief and poverty. In January 1943, he was found unconscious in an abandoned warehouse near King's Cross Station in London. He was taken to St. Pancras Hospital. He had ingested rat poison, a paste containing phosphorus that was used as a rodenticide. Whether it was an attempt to end his life or an act of desperation to eat something, anything, in the final stages of starvation, is something history cannot say with certainty. He died a few days later. He was 33 years old. The coroner recorded his cause of death as phosphorus poisoning. He had no next of kin who claimed him. His body was held in the hospital morgue. Montagu and Cholmondeley had been searching for exactly this kind of case, a person whose death was internal, who had no visible injuries, whose lungs had not yet been examined, and would therefore not contradict the story of drowning at sea if a Spanish pathologist performed a cursory examination. The phosphorus poisoning was a concern, but Montagu consulted with pathologists who told him that a Spanish doctor performing a non-forensic examination on a body that had been in the sea was unlikely to look for it. They obtained the body through proper legal channels, working with the coroner's office. Glyndwr Michael became the raw material for a fabricated British officer, and now Montague and Cholmondeley had to make that officer real. The fictional officer they created was named Captain Acting Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He was assigned to Combined Operations Headquarters, which gave him a plausible reason to be carrying sensitive documents. His age was set to match the body, 36 years old. What Montague and Cholmondeley understood, and what made this operation something other than just a stunt, was the psychology of how intelligence officers read captured documents. A forgery is easy to spot when it's too clean. Real documents have inconsistencies, cross-references to things that exist, human errors, stray details that serve no strategic purpose. A forged set of documents that are suspiciously consistent, suspiciously complete, and contain only relevant information looks exactly like what it is, a constructed narrative. Authenticity is noise. It's the details that don't have to be there. So they gave Major Martin a life made of noise. They gave him a photograph of a fiancée, a woman named Pam, whose photo was actually provided by a female MI5 clerk named Jean Leslie. They wrote love letters from Pam, handwritten and emotional, referencing specific shared experiences, the difficulty of getting time together during the war, her worry about his deployment, the happiness of a recent weekend visit. They wrote a letter from his father, formal and slightly cold, the kind of letter an older man writes to a son he doesn't fully know how to talk to. They created a letter from his bank, complaining about an overdrawn account and requesting that the matter be addressed. They gave him theatre ticket stubs from a London show that had actually been running in the weeks before his supposed death, physical proof that he had been in the city, living a normal life. They gave him a bill for 4 nights at the Naval and Military Club. They gave him a receipt from a London jeweller for an engagement ring because Pam had written about wanting one and Martin had bought it. They gave him a sardine key, the little metal tab used to open tins of sardines, because it was the kind of trivial object you'd find in any man's pocket, and that served no operational purpose whatsoever. The actual false documents, the intelligence payload, were letters exchanged between high-ranking British officers. One was from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, addressed to General Harold Alexander in Tunisia. Another was from Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, addressed to Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Andrew Cunningham in Algiers. The letters did not scream false intelligence. They were written in the elliptical, reference-laden style of intercommand correspondence between people who already share a common context. They discussed logistics, command relationships, and planning in terms that required background knowledge to interpret, and that background knowledge would lead a German intelligence analyst directly to Greece and Sardinia. Sicily was mentioned in one of the documents. But it was mentioned specifically as a cover story, the false target being used to mislead the Axis, while the real attack would come elsewhere. The Germans would read a document in which British officers mentioned Sicily, and in which British officers said Sicily was a deception, which meant the Germans would conclude that the British were genuinely targeting Greece and Sardinia, and that the British knew they had to plant disinformation about Sicily to cover it. It was a deception about a deception, and it was calibrated precisely for how German intelligence analysts were trained to think. The briefcase was a standard-issue black leather dispatch case. Martin's uniform was sourced and fitted. His identity card was produced with an appropriate photograph of a man who resembled the body, closely enough for Spanish inspection purposes. His rank insignia, dog tags, and accreditation were all properly documented. When it was done, Glyndwr Michael, penniless, nameless in death, was wearing the uniform of a major in the Royal Marines, with a name, a fiancé, a father, a bank account, and a mission. Now the only thing left was to get him to Spain without the British Navy, the Spanish Coast Guard, or the German U-boats that patrolled those waters, figuring out what was actually inside the canister being loaded onto HMS Seraph. The body had been refrigerated since January, preserved in dry ice maintained at a temperature designed to keep decomposition at a level consistent with a man who had been in the sea for roughly a week, long enough to account for drift, not so long that examination would place his death weeks or months earlier. Transporting a human corpse through the Bay of Biscay and down to the Spanish coast, in an active war zone submerged for most of the journey, required a degree of organizational creativity that Montague later described as the most bizarre logistical problem of his career. The body was placed inside a sealed metal canister, packed with dry ice. The canister was loaded onto HMS Seraph, a British submarine under a cover story. The crew was told they were transporting sensitive meteorological equipment for an experimental operation. The actual nature of the cargo was known only to the submarine's commanding officer, Lieutenant Norman Jewell, and a very small number of other personnel. HMS Seraph departed from Holy Loch in Scotland in late April 1943 and proceeded on a surface and submerged transit to the southwestern coast of Spain. On the morning of April 30th, 1943 at 4:15 a.m., Seraph surfaced approximately a mile offshore from Huelva. Jewell ordered the canister brought up. The crew on deck was minimal. The body of Glyndwr Michael, Major William Martin, as far as the world would ever know, was removed from the canister, placed in the water face up to aid drift toward shore, and the briefcase was secured to his wrist with a regulation chain. A life preserver was put on the body, not inflated, consistent with an officer who had been alive long enough to put on emergency gear, but not long enough to inflate it. Seraph submerged. The body drifted. At approximately 9:30 a.m., José Antonio Rey Maria, a fisherman working out of Huelva, found the body and pulled it ashore. The local Spanish civil guard was notified. The body was brought to the Spanish Naval Authority in Huelva. The documents were examined. Word reached Adolf Klaus, the Abwehr agent Montague and Cholmondeley had been counting on, within hours. What happened next proved exactly how well Montague and Cholmondeley had read the human variables of this operation. The Spanish, despite being formally neutral, had a government under Francisco Franco that leaned significantly toward the Axis. Spanish military authorities allowed Klaus and his network to examine and photograph the documents before formally returning them to the British vice-consul. The British vice-consul, Francis Hazelden, played his role perfectly, pressing formally for the return of the documents while creating just enough administrative friction that Klaus had time to work. The contents of the documents were transmitted to Berlin. German intelligence, the Abwehr, received the photographs of the documents and subjected them to analysis. The intelligence chain moved upward quickly. Within days, the contents had reached the German High Command. The German analysts applied exactly the kind of sophisticated skepticism that the operation had been designed to exploit. They looked for signs of forgery, inconsistencies, implausibilities, things that didn't add up. They found none. The personal effects were too specific, too emotionally detailed to have been fabricated by an intelligence service. The professional documents were too technically accurate, written in a style that matched authenticated captured Allied correspondence. One German intelligence assessment concluded that the documents were of the greatest value and that the intelligence they contained was genuine. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German Navy, met with Hitler on May 12 to discuss the intelligence. The German Naval War Diary, the official operational record, recorded that Hitler was convinced the documents were genuine and that the main Allied thrust would come at Sardinia and the Peloponnese, not Sicily. Hitler reviewed the intelligence himself. On May 12, 1943, Hitler issued a formal directive, Führerbefehl, ordering the reinforcement of Sardinia and Greece as priority defensive objectives. Panzer divisions previously held in France as strategic reserve were ordered transferred to bolster the Aegean and Balkan defenses. Torpedo boat flotillas were redirected to the eastern Mediterranean. Mine-laying operations were intensified along the Greek coastline. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recently returned from North Africa, was dispatched to inspect and reinforce the Greek defensive positions, a deployment that reflected how seriously Berlin was taking the threat in that direction. And through all of this, Sicily, the actual target, was left with just 2 German divisions on the ground, the 15th Panzergrenadier Division and the Hermann Göring Division. Italian forces were present in larger numbers, but the armored German reinforcements that had been earmarked for Sicily never arrived because mincemeat had redirected them. When the Allies landed with over 150,000 troops on July 9–10, 1943, they faced an island that had been denied the additional German strength it was supposed to receive. The British Prime Minister received a three-word signal that became one of the most famous communications in the entire war. Mincemeat swallowed whole. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, began on the night of July 9, 1943, under conditions that were already being described by Allied planners as exceptionally favorable given the circumstances. The invasion force was massive, over 150,000 troops, approximately 3,200 ships and landing craft, and air support from bases across North Africa. The British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, landed along the southeastern coast. The American Seventh Army, under General George Patton, came ashore on the southwestern coast. What they found was an island that had not been adequately reinforced because the German High Command had spent the previous 2 months hardening Sardinia and Greece. The fighting in Sicily was not bloodless. The campaign lasted 38 days and cost the Allies roughly 22,000 casualties killed, wounded and missing. But the pre-invasion projections had been far grimmer. Allied planners had estimated the campaign might take 90 days and produce catastrophic casualty rates if the island was properly reinforced with German armor. Instead, Sicily fell in 5.5 weeks. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell this story, because the military impact of mincemeat didn't stop at the Sicilian coastline. The broader strategic cascade went further than even Montagu and Cholmondeley had anticipated. Within 3 weeks of the Allied landings, Mussolini was removed from power by his own Grand Council, the first fall of a major Axis head of government. Italy began secret negotiations toward an armistice, which was signed in September 1943. The German strategic position in the Mediterranean collapsed at an accelerating pace, and the forced diversion didn't stay limited to the Mediterranean. Hitler's decision to strip reserves from France and redirect divisions to Greece directly affected German strength on the Eastern Front during one of the most critical periods of that theater. The Kursk Offensive, the largest armored engagement in history, launched by Germany in July 1943, was conducted with divisions that were already stretched and a reserve pool that had been significantly depleted. Historians continue to debate exactly how much of the German weakness at Kursk was attributable to Mediterranean diversions versus other factors. But the operational records are clear. Hitler moved divisions. He moved them because of mincemeat, and the Eastern Front was paying for those movements at the exact moment it could least afford to. Major William Martin, R.M., Sci Captain, Acting Major, Carrier of Secrets, was buried with full military honors in the municipal cemetery of Huelva, Spain, on May 2, 1943. The Spanish authorities treated the burial with appropriate formality. A local British consular official attended. The gravestone carried his fictitious name and rank. According to records documented by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the inscription identified him as William Martin, Royal Marines, with a date of birth set to match the fabricated identity, a complete fiction carved in stone and maintained officially for over 5 decades. It was dignified. It was also completely fictional. For decades, the British government kept the operation classified. Ewan Montagu wrote a book about it in 1953, The Man Who Never Was, but the book deliberately omitted the real identity of the man who had been used. The fiction of Major William Martin was maintained officially. The grave in Huelva was maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as the grave of a British officer killed in service. The actual man, Glyndwr Michael, existed in official records only as a coroner's case, his death certificate. His body listed as used in a classified operation. No monument, no recognition, no connection between the anonymous Welsh labourer found dead in a London warehouse and the grave in Spain that was receiving visitors and official wreaths for decades. It was not until 1996, 53 years after the operation, that researchers, working through declassified documents that had finally been released in the preceding years, confirmed definitively that the body used in Operation Mincemeat was that of Glyndwr Michael. In 1997, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission updated the headstone in Huelva. It now reads, Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin RM. There is a line below that in Spanish, added by the local authorities, which translates roughly to, also lies here Major William Martin, a true British hero. Both names, both men. The one invented and the one who actually existed. The clean narrative of Operation Mincemeat, the one in the books and the 2021 film, tends to present it as a plan that worked because it was brilliant. And it was. But there were at least 3 moments where the entire operation could have collapsed, and none of them were within Montague and Cholmondeley's control. The first was the body itself. Glyndwr Michael had died of phosphorus poisoning, internal organ damage that a thorough pathological examination could potentially identify. If a Spanish doctor looked too closely and found liver damage inconsistent with drowning or detected chemical traces, the whole premise fell apart. Montague had consulted with Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the most celebrated forensic pathologist in Britain at the time. Spilsbury gave a qualified reassurance, qualified being the operative word. The operation proceeded knowing that risk was never fully off the table. The second was Spain. Formerly neutral but under Franco's government, a government with significant Axis sympathies and officials who sat at every point on the spectrum from genuinely neutral to actively pro-German. There was a real chance that some of those officials would quietly return the documents to Britain without ever letting German intelligence photograph them. Huelva and Adolf Claus were the team's best hedge against that outcome. But a hedge is not a guarantee. The third was German skepticism itself. The Abwehr was not staffed with credulous analysts. There were German intelligence officers who looked at the mincemeat documents and argued they looked planted. Too convenient, too perfectly timed. That debate happened inside the German intelligence establishment. The skeptics lost. They lost because the personal effects were too emotionally specific, the professional documents too technically accurate, and, most critically, because the intelligence confirmed something that German planners already partially believed, that Greece and Sardinia were plausible Allied targets. The operation didn't manufacture that belief from nothing. It found the belief that already existed inside German strategic thinking and poured concrete into it. The Germans wanted to believe the documents. They wanted to believe because Greece and Sardinia already seemed like plausible targets. Mincemeat didn't create the German belief in those targets from nothing. It amplified an existing predisposition and then provided what appeared to be physical proof. That psychological understanding, that the best lie is one that the target is already halfway to believing, was the actual genius of the operation. The documents weren't convincing despite German skepticism. They were convincing because the whole architecture of the deception was designed to work with German assumptions rather than against them. Operation Mincemeat was officially declassified in stages over the following decades. The full operational files were released by the Public Record Office in 1996, the same year Glyndwr Michael's identity was finally confirmed. Ewan Montague died in 1985. Charles Cholmondeley died in 1982. Neither lived to see the full declassification. Ben Macintyre's 2010 book, Operation Mincemeat, How a Dead Man and a Bizarre Plan Fooled the Nazis and Assured an Allied Victory, drew on the newly available files and provided the most comprehensive factual account of the operation yet published. It was adapted into a 2021 Netflix film of the same name. The operation has been studied in military academies and intelligence training programs for decades, not primarily as a curiosity, but as a case study in the intersection of psychological analysis, operational security, and deception architecture. The specific technique of exploiting an adversary's existing beliefs rather than trying to override them is now considered a foundational principle of strategic deception. What's less discussed, but maybe the most important part of this story, is the ethical territory that Mincemeat occupied. The British government used the body of a man who had no family, no voice, and no ability to consent. They specifically selected him because he was invisible, because his poverty and isolation meant no one would come looking. The thing that made him useful was the same thing that had made his life impossible. That tension doesn't resolve cleanly. it doesn't resolve at all. If this story is sitting with you differently than most WWII content does, that's the point. Hit like if you think Glyndwr Michael deserves to be remembered by more people than know his name right now. It cost nothing, and it's the most honest reason I can give you to do it. Montague and Cholmondeley understood this. In Ben Macintyre's account, drawn from classified files and Montague's own writings, there is a clear portrait of men who were aware of the moral weight of what they had done. The operation was not sanitized in Montague's own telling, the way it sometimes is in retrospective public narratives. Glyndwr Michael's updated headstone in Glyndwr is, in a way, the most honest conclusion the story has. It acknowledges both identities. It admits that there was a real man before there was a fictional officer. It doesn't resolve the moral complexity, nothing really can, but it refuses the easier path of erasing him again. He died alone in a warehouse in January 1943, having been failed by every system that might have caught him before he got there. Then his country used what was left of him to win a campaign, and then, 54 years later, someone finally put his real name on the stone. Let that land for a second. The most successful military deception of World War II, an operation that contributed directly to the fall of Mussolini, the Allied control of the Mediterranean, and the weakening of German positions on the Eastern Front, was built on a foundation of documents that never existed, an officer who never lived, and a fisherman who didn't know what he had pulled out of the water. The intelligence establishment of the Third Reich, one of the most thorough, paranoid, and technically capable spy networks in history, read love letters written by an MI5 clerk, posing as a woman named Pam, saw a receipt for an engagement ring bought at a London jewellery shop, and concluded they were looking at the real private effects of a real dead man. And they were right about one thing. The man was real. He just wasn't who they thought he was. Operation Mincemeat is proof that in certain moments of war, the most powerful weapon available is not firepower or numbers or materiel. It's the architecture of belief. It's the construction of a reality so internally consistent, so emotionally specific, so aligned with what the enemy already wants to think, that the enemy does the last step for you. They choose to believe it. If this hit different than your average World War II video, drop a comment. Tell me what surprised you. I read them, and the ones that spark real debate always influence what I build next. And if you want to see what other operations the British cooked up during this war that made mincemeat look almost conventional, there's a video waiting for you right now, because Operation Bodyguard, the deception that protected D-Day, made mincemeat look like a rehearsal. See you in that one.